Last week kicked off the start of what I see as a bit of a series here. Wanted to get back to basics. Kind of kicked off with the Charlie Kirk assassination, just because it was such a in-your-face event, and it forced a response from us. Like all the issues that we talk about here on a Sunday morning, we don't talk about the issues per se, because we're going to have whatever opinions we have, and we're free to have whatever those opinions are. Sometimes they tend to be divisive. What we're talking about in here when we talk about current events are what is our response to these events? How do we respond? And in terms of this, I thought it would be good to get back to basics. And one of the ways to do that, at least basics as far as the effect is concerned, is to go back through some of the main themes from my book, The Fifth Way. And we haven't gone over these themes for quite a while. And so last week we talked about the absolute primacy of love. That we can get so sidetracked with all the doctrine, and when things get political and church and politics all seem to get intertwined, how can we separate those things? And how can we get back to that primacy of love? Because that's the key to everything. If we don't understand what Jesus meant when he said that his Father was Abba, and he had that relationship with him that was so all-encompassing, so intimate, and the fact that he was trying to get the people to come back into direct contact with their God, even through the ritual and all the requirements of their religion, to see that as the cornerstone, to see that as the quintessential part of their prayer life. And then we talked about how we take that love out into the marketplace. How do we take it out into the community and the streets of our lives? And we have two primary metaphors that have been kind of used by the church. And the one that's used by the church the most is the metaphor of the warrior, that we are actually fighting a battle here, and that we are fighting that battle until the day we die. But Jesus never uses that image. The image he uses is the image of the gardener, the one who is just bent quietly over the soil. Nobody notices, invisible, but showing up day after day to till and to do the things that need to be done, so that the big piece that happens, realizing it's not even under his control. It happens while he's sleeping. But to show up every day and create the perfect environment for love to flourish, realizing you have no control over that environment. Now, obviously, we need to be both. We need to be warriors and we need to be gardeners. But when we're warriors, to realize that we want to be humble warriors with the heart of a gardener, always looking through the conflict back to those silent fields of home. And then today, wanted to take a look at another issue. Because as we're doing this, and everything that we're trying to learn here at The Effect, is to maintain that place of liminality. And if you're hearing that word for the first time, to be in liminal space means to be on the threshold. It means to be in the doorway between camps. It means that we don't completely come down solidly on any one side of any issue. And even when we do, we retain that part of ourselves that allows us to still be objective, that allows us to still be compassionate. And so sometimes when I talk about liminality and we talk about being in the doorway and on the threshold, people start to think, okay, that's just being kind of milquetoast. That's just being always in the middle, not really taking a side, not being passionate about anything, and nothing could be further from the truth. The truth is we are passionate. The truth is we are taking a way forward that we think is going to create the greatest good for the greatest amount of people for the longest period of time. But even as we're doing that, we still retain our humanity, retain our decency. We were talking last Tuesday, and a woman who had absolutely no connection with Charlie Kirk, in fact, opposed just about every stand and position that he took. When she saw his wife, his widow, give the speech that she gave and actually forgave the man who shot her husband, she said that she was surprised in herself that what she felt for her was nothing but compassion, nothing but a human connection as a woman, as a wife, as a mother. And she was really surprised at how much she just connected. And I said, that's wonderful. And thanks for sharing that, of course. But I said, now you can probably place a really good bet that her politics and theology don't fall far from Charlie Kirk's. So as she takes over his organization and she starts to speak about policy and about theology, will you still be able to retain your sense of connection and humanity then? And she stopped for a second. She said, that's a really good question. That's what liminality is. When we can disagree and still see each other as fellow human beings that deserve our decency and deserve our compassion and deserve our connection, that's what we're talking about. So here at The Effect, when we talk about current events, that's what we're shooting for. What is our response? We're looking to Jesus, of course, as our virtue agent, as our guide. How do we do what Jesus did? Because he was the quintessential example of liminality lived out in the streets. Retaining human decency, retaining critical thought, and always, always acting out of a deep common sense. We give common sense, I think, some short shrift, even though we've been talking about it a lot lately. Without common sense, we can't have critical thought. If we don't realize that common sense is the basis for our critical thought and our ability to criticize our own camp and see truth coming from the outside where we don't expect it, then we're missing the whole ball game. When I finally started to understand Jesus from a first century Aramaic point of view, I realized that common sense was the bedrock, and I had lost that. I'd lost it through all my training as a Catholic. I'd lost it through my training as an evangelical. I'd lost the ability to just be able to think for myself and to use common sense, have permission to use common sense in everything I was doing. But for all our talk about common sense and everything I just said, what is common sense? You know, it's kind of hard to define. And I thought we should take a moment and do just that. What is common sense? If it is so important, and I haven't made that case yet, but if it is so important to our critical thinking and our ability to be liminal in everything that we do, take a look at what the dictionary says. That it is sound and prudent judgment based on a simple perception of the situation or facts that is independent of specialized knowledge, training, or the like. Normal native intelligence. Okay, that comes right out of the Merriam-Webster. Got that? Sound and prudent judgment based on a simple perception of the situation or facts that is independent of specialized knowledge, training, or the like. And that's an important piece. It has nothing to do with your training or your education. It is normal native intelligence. Okay, there's your dictionary definition, but that doesn't really scratch the itch. That really doesn't get down to it. I collected some quotes that people have talked about common sense. See if this helps to fill it out a little bit. Common sense is the knack of seeing things as they are and doing things as they ought to be done. All right, I realize that's subjective, right? But that's what we're bringing. Common sense is judgment without reflection. You don't have to think about it a lot. Shared by an entire class, an entire nation, or the entire human race. It's common to us all. Common sense is genius dressed in its working clothes. I like that one. That's Ralph Waldo Emerson. He always has a way with words now, doesn't he? Science is organized common sense, where many a beautiful theory was killed by an ugly fact. Common sense, organized. Common sense and a sense of humor are the same thing, moving at different speeds. A sense of humor is just common sense dancing. The voice of the Lord is the voice of common sense, which is shared by all that is. There is nothing more uncommon than common sense. Frank Lloyd Wright. Everybody gets so much information all day long that they lose their common sense. And finally, if you have an ounce of common sense and one good friend, you don't need an analyst. That was Joan Crawford. I love that. So, if you really have common sense, this, uninitiated, uneducated understanding of life and how it works and how we ought to act. I mean, it's kind of golden rule sort of stuff in terms of that, right? So if you really have that, certain things in life will just be known to you without having to really think too much about it. For instance, if you have common sense, you will know that you should never, under any circumstances, take a sleeping pill and a laxative on the same night. You're just going to know that. You're going to know not to worry about what people think because they don't do it very often. You're going to know that a person who is nice to you but rude to the waiter is not a nice person. If you have common sense, you're going to know that no man has ever been shot while doing the dishes. That goes doubly for a husband. Do your stuff. You will know that people who want to share their religious views with you almost never want you to share yours with them. If you have common sense, you should never say anything to a woman that even remotely suggests that you think she's pregnant unless you can see an actual baby emerging from her at that moment. And finally, common sense shows us that there is not one shred of evidence supporting the notion that life is serious. We should be able to laugh. We should realize that we're supposed to be happy here. We're supposed to be enjoying the ride. We've turned this thing absolutely upside down and inside out. And we spend so much time in so much stress. So with all that said, how does common sense actually apply to our spirituality? And I wanted to just read a little bit here from the book. And let's see if we can really outline this. Faith isn't rational, but it isn't irrational either. Faith starts as an idea, an assumption we make about the truth that allows us to go out and experience that truth. It's all about action. We've talked about that so much. Call it extra-rational. Common sense still applies. Before it was beaten out of us by the creeds and doctrine and dogma of the church, before it was leached out of us by the relativism, nihilism, and materialism of secular philosophy and humanism, there was a spiritual common sense that we were all born with, and which, if we squint and strain, can still be glimpsed flitting around the edges of our awareness. It's that part of us that asks all the wrong questions, the ones that lack faith, the ones that make teachers squirm or angrily reprimand their students. But the questions persist, even if we stop asking them. And they don't dissipate. There are no answers to be, when there are no answers to be found. And if we've learned to be satisfied with a particular school of thought, a church or a theology, there's still something underneath that remains unsettled, unsettling, which is exactly what makes the teacher defensive and angry at having the edges of the veneer pried up by impertinent and commonsensical questions. Passionate common sense is the check and the balance, the only foothold against a slide into superstition and spiritual irrelevance. It seems we need permission once again to legitimately use our common sense in the realm of the spiritual. Then let's give it. Because in terms of our faith, there are many common sense questions to ask. Like a child shaking off the question of how Santa could possibly descend every chimney during a single night in favor of the promise of Christmas morning. We shake off questions about God's nature and the presence of evil, about sin and judgment, salvation and damnation, scripture and science, in favor of the promise of a secure faith. It's pure irony that in the name of faith, we should stop asking such questions, when to stop asking is the first sign that we are no longer serious about our journey of faith, about following the way of Yeshua. Okay, so there's a big accusation leveled in there, that the church beat the common sense out of us. Is there any evidence for that? Look at it this way. If you want to protect and consolidate your institution, whatever institution it happens to be, it could be religious or it could be secular. If you want to control people within that institution or organization, what is it that you're going to do? Think about that for a second. You're going to do two things, and whether it's religious or secular. The first thing that you're going to need to do is you're going to need to outlaw doubt. You're going to need to stigmatize doubt. And the second thing you're going to need to do is proclaim dogma. Now, dogma is a word that we use, but again, do we really know what it means? All dogma is doctrine, but not all doctrine is dogma. Dogma is doctrine, a statement of belief or faith, a truth, quote unquote, that has been proclaimed by the hierarchy, the higher ups of a given institution, without any evidence for it being true. But it is made to be accepted simply because it came from on high and for no other reason. And so it is accepted on the face because of that call to authority. But there's no evidence that it's actually true. And so this is kind of like a 1-2 punch. You outlaw or you stigmatize doubt, and then you lay out dogma that can't be challenged, can't be questioned. Think about how the church is operated. Think about how you were inculcated, brought into your faith, right? As a Catholic, we couldn't question the church. We were told what we were told. It was the catechism. It was this. It was that. And we weren't in any way able to question that. And think about the way that doubting Thomas has been characterized. Poor Thomas Didymus, right? The doubting Thomas. He's the only one who was honest enough to say that second-hand faith is not going to be good enough for me. I'm going to need a personal experience. This is a basic truth of every single one of us. We can't take hearsay faith from somebody else. Faith can't be handed to us or bestowed upon us. We need to have our own experience. He was the only one honest enough to say that. And yet he has been stigmatized for 2,000 years as the poster child for having lack of faith because he doubted. And in the 4th century, the church, as it became married to the Roman Empire and Roman power, started what is sometimes called the Council Age, in the first council in 325 at Nicaea, and from the 4th to the 8th centuries, 7 major church councils established the orthodoxy of the church. It didn't exist before. It was wild and woolly for the first 300 years. But now it was laid down. This is what the church believes. This is what you must believe. And because they had Roman power behind them, they could enforce and put teeth into that. If you didn't believe the Orthodox line, you could be killed. You could be excommunicated. Your property could be taken. You could be exiled. And so they enforced with the whole Roman apparatus, the dogma and the orthodoxy. But let's just not bag on the church here. Isn't this what's happening in society all the time? Isn't this what political organizations, countries, and governments do? Orwell talked about this in the 40s when he wrote 1984, but he was only mirroring what was seen by all the totalitarian regimes around him. Outlaw doubt, and then establish dogma. It works. It absolutely works. We know this. I remember growing up in the Catholic Church when I was in 1st grade, and I was finally getting the Baltimore Catechism, and we would actually chant it in the classroom, right? And I remember being told, God is, God always was, and God always will be. And I remember going home and laying in bed at night staring at the ceiling thinking, okay, I can get the God is and always will be part, but God was? How does that exactly work? We were talking about turtles all the way down, How do you do the God always? I remember having those questions. I could never voice them in my class, but I had them. And then by 3rd grade, when I had my first communion, let alone confirmation in 8th grade, I'd stopped asking any questions because I'd learned you just accept the party line. And then by my 20s, I stopped thinking about it at all. I basically had just dismissed all of my religion and my spiritual journey completely. And so I just wasn't thinking about it anymore. But by my 30s, when I came back to the church, it came back with a vengeance. I started questioning everything. I remember as I started in pastoral training in preparation to become ordained, one of the things I told the pastor who was mentoring me is I think I want to go to a seminary, maybe Biola or Vanguard or something. Go to a seminary so I can really learn from the ground up. And no, don't do that. Modern seminaries are where you go to lose your faith, not to gain it. So I was discouraged from going to seminary. What does that mean? What was actually happening there? Seminary was where they couldn't control the narrative. Seminary was where they couldn't control the messaging, couldn't control the information that was being passed on. And the whole message was, don't doubt the party line. Don't doubt the orthodoxy that we are teaching you. Wanted to read a couple of quotes here based on that. From René Descartes, this is in your insert if you want to take a look. How valuable is a faith that is dependent on the maintenance of ignorance? Such a faith is indistinguishable from superstition. Now, I realize the hubris of putting me between René Descartes and Paul Tillich, but just go with me on that, all right? This is a quote from The Fifth Way. But it says exactly what I wanted to say. They told me I shouldn't go to seminary. I should stay with them so that I didn't lose my faith. But how valuable is that faith if it's dependent on the maintenance of ignorance? If there are things that I can't learn or can't know, because that faith is what? So fragile? Such a faith is indistinguishable from superstition. And René Descartes, if you would be a real seeker after truth, it is necessary that at least once in your life you doubt, as far as possible, all things. And from Paul Tillich, doubt isn't the opposite of faith, it's an element of faith, right? And we've gone even further to say that doubt isn't even necessarily an element of faith. Doubt is what gives faith its actual definition. Just as courage means nothing unless there is fear present. If there's no fear, there's no courage. If there's no doubt, there's no faith. Courage is the ability to act in the presence of fear. It has to be fear. Faith is the ability to act in the presence of doubt. If there's no doubt, there's no faith. I had posted this Paul Tillich quote once on social media and immediately got back, a response that was in rebuttal, of course, right? And it came from a man who called himself Thomas. I thought that was really ironic. Here's Thomas, and he's bashing doubt, right? But he quoted Matthew 21:21. Take a look. Jesus answered and said to them, "Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what was done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, it will happen." Wow. That sounds like it just refuted everything I just said. So never mind, let's all go home. But what's going on here, of course, that this is not a literal saying. This is a metaphorical saying. The fig tree and the mountain are metaphors that Jesus uses and has used over and over again. You remember what the fig tree comes from? The cursing of the fig tree. He sees the fig tree from a distance. It looks all verdant and green. But when he gets up close and he's hungry, there's no figs on it. And so he curses the fig tree, even though it wasn't the season for figs, and the tree withers and dies. Kind of anti-Jesus, isn't it? Why would he curse the fig tree? Why blame the poor tree? But that story comes right on the heels of the cleansing of the temple. You look at the temple from the outside, and it's white, and it's beautiful, and it is the emblem of all of Jewish identity and the source of their faith. And yet inside, it's just a den of thieves. From the outside, it looks like something. From the inside, you see the truth. What Jesus is talking about is discerning truth, the ability to discern truth, to see beneath the veneer, to see beneath the outside. The fig tree is a metaphor for that. And the mountain, well, mountains aren't a big deal to us anymore because we can just fly over them or drive a car through the pass that's been cut for us really neatly. But in ancient times, a mountain was a huge boundary that you could not cross. And so it symbolizes, as a metaphor, all of the obstacles that you have in your life. And then if you take into consideration that the word doubt here, in the Greek, the akrino, or in the Aramaic, belag, what that word actually means is to separate, to divide, to withdraw from, to oppose, to hesitate, to waver. See where this word is going? Yeah, doubt fits in there, but look at all those other understandings of how this works. In other words, doubt here, this word that we translate as doubt, means the opposite of perseverance. To waver, to be diverted from, to be distracted, is to doubt in this sense. So what is Jesus really saying? He says, if you persevere, if you have undiverted and undivided action and choice, then you will be able to discern the truth of things, not be led astray by the facade, and you will be able to overcome the obstacles in your life. Not talking about cognitive belief, just mental assent. He's talking about action, not just mere disbelief, but action. Because the truth is, you can have doubt and still persevere in faith fully. It's not the presence of doubt that means we have no faith. It's if we stop acting because of the doubt that we have lost our faith. Now, we can't discern truth if we've drunk the Kool-Aid of any one camp, any one theology, any one religion. If we've bought all the dogma, we have ceased to think. How in the world can we discern the truth of anything if we're completely encapsulated and we're inside, if we've learned not to question anymore? Our doubt and our common sense is the check and the balance against mere superstition, falling into complete and blind obedience. Remember, common sense is independent of any training or any knowledge. It's the basic perception, the cognition that we're all born with. As long as it hasn't been beaten out of us, as long as it hasn't been educated out of us, and we can get educated out of our common sense as well. We got to keep questioning. We got to keep doubting. We need to keep common sense alive. Remember the story I told you a few weeks ago about that 17-year-old? You know, the father that angrily contacted me from Minnesota, of all places, and said his son, his 17-year-old son, he was an elder in the church, had been peppering him with question after question after question and challenging his belief system and his authority in the home. And he finally said, where are you getting all of this? And he handed him the Effects website domain. And so it's like, oh, yeah. So that's why he was contacting me. But ultimately, his 17-year-old son said to him, Dad, I need to know if what you believe is really true or if it's just what you believe. See, these are the questions that our younger generation is still asking. Some of us have stopped asking. We need to start again. Many of our younger people have been leaving the church for decades now, exploring other faith traditions, Buddhism, Eastern Orthodoxy, or just secularism, and even neo-paganism, right? I have another story that comes from another father. This one came through our treatment program here, lived down in San Diego. And he contacted me, sometime after he left our program. And his son, to the horror of him, who was a nominal Christian, not a big Christian, but a nominal Christian, and his wife, who was a dyed-in-the-wool Catholic. How they got that household together is an amazing thing, right? But she was a staunch, strong Catholic. And their son had just announced that he had joined another religious tradition called Asatru. I had to look it up. I had no idea. Asatru? Well, it turns out that Asatru is a neo-pagan religion that comes out of the early 70s, kind of a recreation of the old Norse traditions or Germanic traditions. You got Odin and Thor and Loki and all that pantheon of gods there. So you've got those guys. And as I researched further about it, what was it based in? What was the whole point? The whole point was to find your roots, to find connection, and to come home again was the whole idea behind this neo-pagan religion. So to explore the roots, where do your roots come from? Who are your ancestors? And then to find the connection between you and the earth and everything around you and all the people, and then to have that sense of coming home. I suppose what Paul would call being content in all your circumstances. So isn't it obvious why a young boy would be drawn to a religion like that? He hadn't seen that modeled in his own home. His home was dysfunctional. His father was an alcoholic, only recently in recovery. His mother was this literal and controlling Catholic, and probably that control didn't just end at the edges of her religion, right? Of course he's looking for roots. He's looking for connection. He's looking for coming home. So the father says, what do I do? I said, you know what? What I think you should do is don't oppose your son. Don't try to shout it down. Don't try to resist it. Study with him. Study what he's studying. Read with him. And in the conversation that you will have, you can compare and contrast what you believe, and you can compare and contrast Jesus with what he's learning there. And he kept up with me for a few months while he was going through this. And his boy went from Asatru to Satanism, but modern Satanism isn't what you think, and then to the Temple of Set, which is an offshoot of Satanism, which are really more philosophical systems, but what they're worshiping is self-knowledge. The highest good is the good for you as yourself, and the mechanism by which you obtain that. And then from there, he circled all the way back to Christianity and started asking his father questions about Christianity that his dad couldn't even answer. But look what happened here. By allowing the questioning, by giving permission to the questioning, by following along, walking down the path with his son, they were able to retain a relationship. And he allowed his son the permission to give vent to his questioning, to let the common sense bring him around, and brought him right back where he started again. Because it was no longer just a rebellion against his parents. It was no longer a rebellion against that household. Now it could become an authentic journey for him and take him where he needed to go. It's a beautiful thing when we allow the questioning to happen. The greatest thing we can do when we love someone is to give them the freedom to be who they are. If love is coerced in any way, it's not love anymore. To allow that means everything. Another quote from The Fifth Way. Many of us have stopped asking common sense questions, or never began in the first place. We have simply accepted the received tenets of our faith on faith. So the task left to our children, the 17-year-olds among us, with the audacity to look behind the curtain. And they are looking and asking. Their whole generation, aided by a few of their elders, is looking and asking. And the rest of us are uncomfortable, perhaps defensive, and increasingly irrelevant to their search. Call it postmodern thought or emerging church or blatant heresy. We can try to resist, but it's all about the common sense God gave each of us, inevitably reasserting itself after too much time away. All new human ideas and questions begin as heresy, advance to orthodoxy, and end in superstition, to paraphrase Thomas Huxley. But because something is shunned as heresy doesn't mean it's also not true. And accepting something as orthodox doesn't make it true. And of course, by the time orthodoxy devolves to superstition, all common sense and critical thought is lost. Prevailing opinion has nothing to do with truth. The two are as far apart as the East is from the West, intertwined only in the mind of the person who has lost touch with common sense. I know I told this story before about Marion and my being kicked out into the real world of Christianity when we were not, our pastor refused to marry us because we didn't fit the criteria that they had for Christian divorce and remarriage. They said that our first marriages didn't have a biblical reason. And so without that adultery in our marriages as a reason for a legitimate divorce, we couldn't get remarried, or that would be adultery. And talk about common sense banging up against, the tenets of our church and our faith. I'm watching pastors sending, especially women, back to abusive relationships because there wasn't any adultery. We're watching all of these inconsistencies. But it was because of that that I actually started my whole journey, because it didn't line up with common sense. If my faith couldn't line up with common sense, what am I supposed to do with that? How can I follow the church? How can I follow Jesus if there's no common sense? And what I realized when I did find this Aramaic Jesus, he's full of common sense. He always makes common sense, and he's always pointing back to the Father's love every single time without exception. And then I further realized as I continued to read and study that all the great characters of faith in the scriptures questioned everything. What about Abram, later to be called Abraham, and the first Hebrews, his family, the ones that questioned the prevailing belief in polytheism in all of the ancient Semitic world and experienced their God as one God? Without that questioning, without that willingness and desire to push through the tenets that were all around them and to have the singular experience they had of the one God, we wouldn't have the religion that we have today. And neither would Islam, and neither would the Jews. And then there's Jesus himself, constantly questioning the prevailing belief in legalism and institutionalism that had taken his faith over by the time he comes on the scene in the first century. And he was then able to experience his God, starting in the wilderness, we suppose, as Abba, as this intimate connection point. The first 300 years of the church, the Christians, quote unquote, the followers of Jesus, the members of the Jesus movement questioned everything. Everyone on a street corner had a different idea of what this meant theologically, to have experienced God now as a single Father, and now a Son, and now a Spirit. What did that even mean? Everybody was questioning everything. And after 325 years, Constantine is trying to put his empire back together again, and he galvanizes the church and starts the church councils. And that began the orthodoxy that the church never had up to that point. And in the West, that turned into the medieval church from about the 5th to the 15th centuries, 1,000 years there, which controlled all knowledge, controlled all politics. The popes could tell the kings what to do in Western Europe. And they outlawed doubt to the point of death until the Renaissance hits, 14th through 17th centuries. And then the Enlightenment, right on the heels of that, the 17th through the 19th centuries, where all of the West was questioning everything about life, about science, about cosmology, and the church was apoplectic. The church was going nuts. In the early modern era, you had Copernicus and Galileo, the 1-2 punch, saying, hey, you know what? The sun and all the planets don't revolve around the earth. It's not earth-centric, it's heliocentric. We all revolve around the sun. That was common sense. Once you had a telescope and you had a brain, you could look, you could see the movements, and you could tell what they were all about. But what did the church do? They arrested Galileo. They sent him in front of the Inquisition. He had to recant everything that he said that he believed so that he wouldn't be killed. And then they put him under house arrest for the next 10 years until he died. That was the church's response to anything that went against what they believed. And why in the world would they be so incensed about the sun being the center of the solar system and the earth revolving around it? Because if you take a look at a few sample verses from Scripture, take a look at Psalms. Psalm 104, verse 5. He set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved. See how they took that as a central earth and everything move around it? Ecclesiastes 1:5, also the sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises there again. And so we see the sun is doing the moving. But take a look for a second here. That word sha'af that has been translated here as hastening, what that means primarily is to pant or to pant for. It means to be longing or to long for. So how else could this be translated? Underneath, also the sun rises and the sun sets and returns again, panting, wearily. Isn't that a beautiful image? Anthropomorphizing the sun. And also the sun rises and the sun sets and longs to return to its starting place. Some translations give it masculine quality and longs to return to his starting place, because the sun is being given personhood. The sun is being looked at as a person. What does that mean? It means Ecclesiastes is poetry. And the Psalms are song lyrics. We know that we don't interpret poetry and song lyrics in the same way that we interpret prose. We know that it's common sense. But when you lose that perspective, and you're saying that every word literally has to be true, then we lose the fact that there are different types of literature in our scriptures. In the 16th century, Martin Luther began questioning the church, the corruption of the church, the doctrine of the Roman church, And he ended up starting the Reformation, not because he wanted to, but because the Roman Church excommunicated him because he wouldn't bend to what they believed at that time. And now we had a major split, the third split within the Christian church. So this modern era that we've been in for the last 500 years sort of ended at the end of World War II. The past 70 years has been considered the postmodern era. And like 500 years ago, when this intense questioning was going on, we're in a time right now of great questioning again. Questioning of the beliefs that we have. The entire worldview, really. Some theologians and some historians believe that we're on a 500-year cycle. Did you know that? That every 500 years, the church and civilization goes through a time of a complete reset. And they believe we're in such a reset right now. Well, whether that's true or not is not so much the point. But again, whether this cycle or not, we are in a time of questioning and a time of doubt. And I actually see that as a good thing. Let me read one more passage here. Why would I say that being in a time of doubt is a good thing? Because each one of us is responsible for his or her own journey to truth. No one can take it for us, and no one can give us his or hers. The ruby slippers Dorothy wears can take her home at any moment, but no one can tell her how they work. She has to find out for herself. We will be convinced of the truth of something only when we have gone out and become convinced, submitted it to rigorous testing in the laboratory of our lives. People were amazed at Yeshua's teaching because he taught with authority, not as the Pharisees and the scribes taught. That is, Yeshua was the same person living or dying. His truths were part of the reality of his life and not just a classroom exercise. Taste and see that the Lord is good, the Psalms tell us. Taste and see, not sit and think. For us, as much as for the ancients, we need to get out of our minds and classrooms and into the streets of our lives to find God playing among us. If we're afraid of looking heretical in someone's eyes, we'll never ask the first question, postulate the first idea, or set out on a journey to truth. Thank God Yeshua and his followers weren't afraid to be called heretics, or drunkards, or gluttons, or Francis of Assisi, Galileo, Martin Luther, or a 17-year-old boy challenging his father's beliefs. If we're afraid to ask the most basic, most common sense questions, we'll never be able to answer the most relevant question. Who am I? Which itself only has meaning as we come to know ultimate reality in the person of God. And without knowing who God is, the true radical nature of love, will never enter the kingdom, live the transformed life toward which Yeshua is trying to guide us. We'll never understand how God and love, kingdom, and transformed life are really all the same thing. Find one, find them all. And even having said that, didn't Jesus tell us to believe and not doubt? Take a look at John 11. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Sounds like a call to orthodoxy to me, doesn't it? Right? That sounds like a call to certainty and not doubt. Yeah? But again, we have to take a look at the words. The word there for belief, pisteuo in Greek and etamen in Aramaic. It can mean belief, but it's never apart from both faith and trust. It's as if that word is a continuum from the first idea that we say we're going to believe to the action upon that idea, to the experience that we can trust that idea. Belief, faith, trust. But the ultimate is trust. If we really want to understand the essence of any scriptural passage that uses this word, I am the resurrection and the life, he who trusts in me, which means we've already had the experience of walking down that road. It's all about trust. And who are we trusting? Well, we're trusting Jesus. But who is that? See, we imagine Jesus as the orthodox creation of the church as it has been handed down to us. That is our image of Jesus. We've westernized Jesus. We've familiarized Jesus. We've domesticated Jesus as this orthodox picture. But who is this Jesus really? The Jesus of the Gospels is wildly radical, hyper-aware, seeing through the facades of everything, discerning the truth, and then calling us out of our stuck and familiar places, trying to wake us up to question what common sense actually is showing us, to ask those common sense questions just as he does continuously. There is no dogma with Jesus. You will find none. He doesn't really give us doctrine either. He shows us how to live. He shows us how to live with a spiritual common sense that shines a spotlight on every part of our lives, an unforgiving spotlight that will show us what is really there if we'll lean into it, if we'll trust it. To trust, to have faith in this Jesus, is to do what he did. Not to pledge allegiance, but to do what he did, to step out of the boat into unfamiliar waters. There's no other way, he says, to his Father, to God, but this way. Because there's no way to know God through orthodoxy, that which is given to us. It can't be. This knowing of our God can't be known by anything that is bestowed, that is taught secondhand. Now, I know that it's tricky. There's comfort in what's familiar, especially what millions have believed for millennia. Lots of comfort in that. Those roots go really deep. And it's not that they're wrong. It's just if we haven't questioned them and run through the gauntlet of our own hero's journey, of our own rite of passage, they're not ours. They're somebody else's. And they won't be there for us when the storm comes, because our house won't have been built on the solid rock. We still need to take the journey. And so the question becomes, how invested are we in the orthodoxy? How invested are we in what we have been given and taught? And how unwilling are we to begin the process of questioning, using our common sense? Well, I'm telling you, Jesus is giving us absolute permission to use our common sense and to question. And to trust Jesus fully is to have journeyed through our own doubt and our own fear to a different kind of assurance, not cognitive, but absolutely experiential. Taste and see that the Lord is good. One bit more. If our desire is the engine, then our common sense is the rudder. Those of us who are most invested in any school of thought, who've spent the most time studying, training, practicing, are the ones most in need of asking that 17-year-old's question, because our common sense may have the most layers of accumulated dust. We can use our common sense as a sort of divining rod, the forked branch fabled to vibrate in the presence of water, to guide us to the right questions that will lead us not necessarily to the right answers, but to the right experiences that will convince us of the truth. There really is no other way, which is what Yeshua meant when he said he was the way, that no one comes to the Father but through him, through that way of living life as he lived and experienced it. From the lips of Shakespeare's Hamlet, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, because the most important questions are not so easily asked. What do you ask when you don't know what you don't know? Why would you ask when what you do know seems to be all there is? But if we simply are willing to begin the journey, there will come the shattering moment when we get the first glimpse of a little man behind the green curtain working the controls of a world we never knew existed. No matter how fleeting the glimpse, it can't be unseen, and everything is forever changed. Let's pray. Father, here we are. Whatever we think we know, whatever we believe, however deeply we believe it, grant us the desire to continue to question, to find that you are inexhaustible, that there is never a point that we have you all figured out, that our beliefs can be just static, that there will always be more with you, another corner to turn, another vista to behold, and that we want to keep seeing everything that you have to show us. So keep our doubt intact. Keep our common sense right in the forefront of our minds. And keep our faith and courage such that we will continue to walk through and persevere through whatever is thrown at us as we veer off the orthodox line, the party line. You know how difficult that is, how lonely sometimes that can be. But we want you more than we want that recognition. Help us to continue to use everything that you've given us to get as close to you as we possibly can, this moment and the next and the next and the next. Thank you, Father, for always being with us. Never let us forget we can only love because you loved us first. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand.